let's skip to Hebrews 11:22. Eric? Yeah. So in the preceding verses that you have there are about Joseph's death, his embalming and entombment in Egypt, and then finally his movement from Egypt to the Promised Land and burial there. And he made these decisions in advance of how that was going to take place. So we had a very long, because of Joseph's position in Egypt, he was treated like royalty and was embalmed, and then his bones were carried, just like it showed in the movie, carried from Egypt to the Promised Land by the Israelites as they left their captivity. Jude 1:9 and Deuteronomy 34:6 talk about the burial of Moses. So essentially what we've got here is regarding the patriarchs, the well-known people of the Bible, faithful people, they were buried. They had tombs, and that was the procedure that was used in handling their earthly remains. The kings who followed, we have some examples here as well. Let's look at 2 Chronicles 32:33 and 1 Kings 14:12 and 13. Okay, let's look at 2 Chronicles 32:33. Okay, so Hezekiah buried, faithful king, buried with his fathers. And what I want to compare that to is the 1 Kings 14:12 and 13. Okay, now the point in this one is that you've got Jeroboam, the king, who was not a good guy, and his sons were not good guys except one. And the only one that was this Abijah, Abijah, and he was the only one who got to be buried. All the rest of them did not get to be buried. So, and backing up, 2 Chronicles 28, that's Ahaz. He was a king, but he was buried, but not with the other kings. Now because he was king, he got to be buried, but he didn't get to be buried with the good kings because he was a bad king. And in 2 Chronicles 35, we have Josiah, who was a faithful king, and he was buried with his fathers. So what you see here in the kings, essentially, were the more faithful they were, the more likely they were to be buried ceremonially with their fathers, and the less faithful they were or unfaithful, they may have been buried, but in a nasty way. They didn't receive the honor that they would have received otherwise. So the death and burial of the patriarchs and the good kings of Israel gave honor to God and to the faith of the dead. So this burial was tied to their faithfulness. Now, there are some examples of really bad things. And I just called it here the horror of no burial. And I'm going to run down through these quick because I would like to get to the other side of the page. So in the first section here, Deuteronomy 28 talks about a curse that would be on the unfaithful Israel, that they would become food for the birds and the beasts, essentially. The second one, 2 Kings 9, is the story of Jezebel. And of course, she was eaten by dogs. Jeremiah 22 is Jehoiakim, who was an unfaithful king, and his body just got dumped outside the city. Again, food for the wild animals. And in Isaiah 14, it talks about a curse essentially on Babylon itself, in which their bodies would simply be trampled underfoot. You know, kind of like when you see the guy that's trying to steal the horses and the stagecoach, you know, and he tries to jump on the horse and fails, and he's trampled underneath the running horses and is flipped up underneath the wheels of the stagecoach and all that. That's Mike. See, there's a cowboy thing to everything. There's an analogy for everything. So I'm going to skip right over those and go down to the punishment by burning. So I want to look at Leviticus 20:14, Amos 2:1 and 2, and 2 Kings 23. So whoever has Leviticus 20, Glenn, do you have that? Yeah, go ahead. 20:14.
He and they shall be buried with fire, that there may be no depravity among us.
Okay, yeah. So in this case, you've got this horrible sin committed against God's command, and these people are to be burned. That's a punishment, burned up. Let's see, Amos 2:1 and 2. Anybody have that one? I know we don't look up Amos very often. Yeah. So here you're hearing about fire as and burning up as a form of broad punishment. It's sort of like Sodom and Gomorrah. I didn't include that one here, but it's very similar to that idea. Then 2 Kings 23, 19 and 20. Okay. My pages are stuck together. Hang on. There we go. So this is when we mentioned earlier, one of the reasons I included this one was that one of the faithful kings was Josiah, and one of the reasons he was seen as faithful was because he knocked down all the shrines of the Baal priests and others, and basically took over all of that, and then he sacrificed all those priests by burning them on their altars. So that was kind of a nice tit for tat there, wasn't it? So anyway, in these examples, the destruction of one's body without burial or by burning is associated with either divine punishment or a faithless death and God's judgment. And that's why we see these in our discussion on this, the fact that we don't find body burning anywhere mentioned favorably in the scriptures. On the New Testament side, on the next page, we have several other examples. So these will all be easy to find. Matthew 14, let's look at that one. And Mark 16:1. Let's look at those two. Right. Okay. In this case, we have not only do we have burial mentioned here, but it also you kind of get a sense for how the speed at which this takes place, and which is something else that we wanted to point out, because this is the disposition of the body of John the Baptist, who was beheaded, and you find that before they ever went to Jesus to tell him about it, they actually buried him, which is, I think, kind of interesting that it took place that quickly. And then Mark 16:1. Okay, so in this case, we have the burial of Jesus and a ritual performed in regard to that burial, even though it occurred out of order because of the lateness of the day on the Sabbath, of the day before the Sabbath. It still occurred. And then I guess we should really look up John 19:38 to 42 as well. Anybody that wants to just jump in there. Yeah, should have read that one first, but I think it's interesting that Nicodemus had everything already ready to go in terms of this burial. He had all the stuff. He had all the burial preparations at that time, and so we see once again there's kind of a common procedure, a ritual of burial for disposition of the dead that included these fragrant attachments and oils and that sort of thing that went along with it. So the New Testament example is one in which we have a preparation of a body for quick burial after death. So that's kind of what we have and we see that today. I mean, when you see these deaths in the Middle East, I think it's probably true in Israel as well, but particularly when you see it in the Arab areas, somebody dies. I mean, they're buried by the next day. They have this very intentional process. So, Scriptures witness death and resurrection. Now I've got some of these printed out here so we don't have to look them up. But in Genesis 3:19, we see God saying, "By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return." That gives us a picture, doesn't it, of God's vision of how our bodies will be handled, what will come of them. I find it very interesting that in Acts 23, in this dispute that we see surrounding Paul, now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, he was essentially almost on trial. It wasn't a trial, but it could have almost the same thing. Brothers, I'm a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees, and it is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. Well, that immediately, half of the people there were on his side. Because, as it says, when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there's no resurrection, nor angels, nor spirits, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So, even though the Pharisees caused Jesus a lot of trouble and caused Paul a lot of trouble, they still were closer in their beliefs regarding almost everything than were the Sadducees. And they were supporters also, we see, of this, the idea of a resurrection of the body, the resurrection of the body from the dead. From 1 Corinthians 15, but there is an order to this resurrection. Christ was raised as the first of the harvest, then all who belong to Christ will be raised when he comes back. And we see this verbiage that's being used, this harvest, Jesus being the first, and we all are going to follow him. Now, last time we mentioned that when the Christian church was growing and spreading throughout the world, one of the ways that people archaeologically have determined that is that as Christianity spread, cemeteries sprung up because there was a concept of burial that very much was associated with the idea of resurrection. In the German, the cemetery word is Gottsacker, which is God's acre or God's field. And so that's what the word means, is cemetery, is God's field. And therefore, we see this idea of burial, particularly burial in the ground, as sowing, ground being sowed. You're sowing this, as Paul says and describes it. It makes complete sense when you think of it that way. He's talking about this very thing. It is sown a natural body. It's raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. Thus it's written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. But it's not the spiritual that is first, but the natural, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so also are all those who are of the dust. And as is the man of heaven, so also are those who are of heaven. And all those of heaven are those who are in the Gottessäcker, in the church cemetery, essentially. Those who are anticipating the resurrection of the dead. So we share in Christ's resurrection, which means we will be raised from the dead bodily. So we've had this whole witness of Scripture, and if we put it together under the application side, you can kind of see a progression where I'm not going to say any of these are wrong, but they have a progression of somewhat better. Cremation does not have a significant scriptural witness to its honoring God, honoring the Creator, or honoring the body that He created, because it is a form of God's punishment. He's used that means to demonstrate His wrath. The embalming and burial, as we saw in Joseph, is sort of halfway, we could say a little bit better. And in our day, we'd probably say that too. And then you have the option of neither cremating nor embalming. And here's what I'm going to say. the cremation essentially speeds up the idea of returning to dust. Embalming slows it down. Whereas the neither cremating nor embalming, but the quick burial that we see taking place is kind of right where it needs to be. Or I shouldn't say needs to be, but it's right in line with natural decomposition, I'll put it that way. The natural way by which we return to the dust, the normal way. That's where I'll leave that, because it's not, nowhere are we commanded one way or the other. It was brought up earlier, I'll mention this quick, about composting. This is something that's fairly new. And this falls in the area of speeding up the natural process. And as I labeled it here, it turns you're no longer seed, but soil. You're no longer seed, but soil. The world's first funeral home dedicated to composting human beings is scheduled to open next year in Seattle, Washington. Where else? It's known as organic reduction. What they do is they have these tubes that rotate like a drum, and they put the body in with alfalfa, wood chips, the same kind of stuff that you get down here at the recycling place. And over a period of about 6 or 7 weeks, it is reduced to compost, and then is ground somewhat. And the plan is to use it as soil somewhere and add it to people's gardens or use it some other way. So that, what I find interesting is the CEO of this outfit says these days some families regard even ashes from cremation as a burden, not a joy. Well, it's not supposed to be a joy, for one thing. It is a reminder of the sin that led us to the point of death to begin with. But people who are more and more having difficulty deciding what to do with cremains. They don't want to deal with it. So dad or mom ends up sitting on a shelf in the garage somewhere, waiting for the next generation to have to figure out what to do. So that's kind of it. I hope I haven't burdened you with anything. I wish, I really do, I wish we could shorten the length of time between death and burial, because today it's gotten longer and longer and longer, where we see funerals, even regular funerals, occurring a week or even 10 days after the point of death, which that whole period in there is horrible for everyone involved. But that's just me talking. All I know is Jolene and I have our plots out at the Oakshade Cemetery, and I don't know what she's going to do, but I'm probably going to be buried, but I'd kind of like to go that quick route, if at all possible, but we'll see. There's one last thing I want to mention here, and that has to do with changing funeral practices. And you can read it yourself. How many of you ever were in a congregation where you had flower ladies for funerals? Did you ever experience that, flower ladies? Yeah, they were the female equivalent of pallbearers, but last time we talked how people don't want flowers anymore, so there's very little use for flower ladies who had, I remember my mother, it was a big honor to be a flower lady for a friend's funeral, and they would arrange the flowers in the church, take them out to the cemetery, arrange them out there, and then do whatever was needed to properly dispose or distribute them afterwards. And that was a big deal, but no flower ladies anymore to speak of. So, all right, we're done. Thanks a lot. I've run over my time. Any questions, comments, thoughts? What's that?
I went to my grandma and grandpa's and I stayed there until tomorrow.
Really? You stayed. Which grandpa and grandpa is that you're going to stay with?
Grandma and grandpa Miller.
Okay, good, good. Good. All right. That's very nice. Okay, we're done. Had me over a barrel there for a minute.